The beginning of joy. Andrew Miles sat quietly in his airplane seat, his hand clutching a crumpled photo of his wife, Eleanor, and the smiling face of his mother, Margaret. The image was slightly faded, taken nearly 6 months ago, just before he had left for an extended business trip to establish a new overseas branch of his logistics company. Eleanor's laughter seemed almost alive in the picture, her hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded stomach. Back then, the thought of returning to meet his child, his firstborn, had been a powerful motivation. Despite countless heartbreaks, failed fertility treatments, and moments of despair, they had finally received the miracle they had prayed for. Now, as the airplane began its descent into the city, Andrew's chest swelled with a mix of anxiety and excitement. Eleanor had gone into labor 2 weeks earlier, delivering a healthy baby girl. The hospital's calls and the video updates from Eleanor and Margaret had sustained him during the final days of his work abroad. Andrew had missed the birth. He hadn't been there for the moment he had longed for, when he would finally meet the baby he'd thought would never arrive. Yet the thought of holding his newborn daughter filled him with a sense of completeness he couldn't quite articulate. When the plane touched down, Andrew's driver, Paul, was waiting for him outside the bustling terminal. Paul held a sign bearing Andrew's name in bold letters, his warm smile genuine as Andrew approached. "Welcome back, Mr. Miles," Paul said, opening the trunk of the sleek black sedan to stow Andrew's luggage. "It's good to see you home." "Thanks, Paul," Andrew replied, his voice thick with exhaustion, but touched by joy. "I can't wait to meet her." Paul nodded knowingly. "The family's at the hospital now. Mrs. Eleanor and your mother are waiting. I heard the baby is beautiful." Andrew leaned back in the car, letting his mind race with thoughts of Eleanor and their baby. He wondered if the baby had Eleanor's striking green eyes or his own darker features. "Paul," he said after a few moments of silence, "everything went smoothly, right? No surprises?" Paul hesitated briefly before responding. "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir. Just the usual hospital visits and checkups before the birth. Mrs. Eleanor and Margaret handled everything perfectly." The words should have reassured him, but there was something in Paul's tone that made Andrew pause. He shook it off, probably just his nerves after the long flight. Upon reaching the hospital, Andrew was met with the scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of medical equipment. The nurse at the front desk directed him to room 501 in the maternity wing. The walk to the room felt like a marathon. His heart pounded with every step. When he finally pushed open the door, the sight that greeted him brought tears to his eyes. Eleanor sat on the hospital bed, cradling a tiny swaddled bundle. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, but her smile was radiant. Margaret stood beside her, her face glowing with pride. "Andrew," Eleanor exclaimed, her voice filled with emotion. "You're here." Andrew crossed the room in a few quick strides, his breath catching as he gazed at the bundle in Eleanor's arms. The baby's tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, fingers impossibly small. "Meet Lily," Eleanor said softly, her voice trembling with joy. Andrew's throat tightened as he knelt beside the bed, his hand shaking as he gently touched his daughter's cheek. Her eyes were closed, her face impossibly delicate. "She's perfect," Andrew whispered, his voice breaking. "She couldn't wait for you," Margaret said with a chuckle, patting her son's shoulder. "Came a bit early, but she's strong and healthy." Andrew nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from Lily. The moment felt surreal, as though time had stopped. "You've made me the happiest man alive," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor leaned forward, her free hand resting on his cheek. "We've waited so long for this moment, Andrew. She's everything we dreamed of." However, as Andrew held his daughter for the first time, a flicker of unease passed through him. Something about the room felt off. It was subtle, a strange tension that hung in the air, masked by the overwhelming joy of the occasion. He shook it off, blaming the fatigue from his long journey. Later, As he helped Eleanor into a wheelchair and cradled Lily in her car seat, Andrew's happiness began to settle into a quiet contentment. The drive home was filled with laughter and light conversation, but Andrew couldn't shake a subtle feeling in the back of his mind. Margaret chatted animatedly about preparing the nursery, and Eleanor beamed as she described her early days with Lily. But when Andrew glanced at his wife, he noticed the fleeting worry in her eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked gently, reaching over to squeeze Eleanor's hand. She hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. "Of course, I think I'm just a little overwhelmed. It's been a whirlwind." Andrew smiled and pressed a kiss to her hand. "We'll figure it all out together." Eleanor returned his smile, but the shadows in her eyes lingered. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, Andrew felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the start of a new chapter, a future he had worked tirelessly to build. But deep down, a whisper of doubt lingered, growing louder as he carried Lily into the house. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a journey that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family, love, and trust. Shadows beneath the joy. Andrew stood in the nursery, his gaze fixed on the delicate mobile spinning above Lily's crib. It was handmade, with tiny stars and moons that glimmered faintly in the soft glow of the nightlight. Eleanor had insisted on it, spending weeks perfecting the design. She had wanted everything to be perfect for their child. Lily lay peacefully in her crib, her tiny hands curling and uncurling as she dreamed. The sight filled Andrew with an overwhelming sense of love. Yet beneath that love, there was a faint, nagging unease he couldn't shake. Downstairs, Margaret and Eleanor were chatting in hushed tones. Their voices carried faintly up the stairs, though Andrew couldn't make out the words. The warmth of their reunion after his 6-month absence was comforting, but something about their dynamic felt guarded. He pushed the thought aside. Surely he was imagining things. 6 months away had made him a stranger to his own household's rhythms. Perhaps he simply needed time to adjust. As he stepped out of the nursery, his phone buzzed. It was Paul, his driver. Andrew hesitated, glancing back toward the faint lights spilling into the hallway. Answering a call this late felt wrong, but something urged him to pick up. "Paul," he said quietly. "Mr. Miles." Paul's voice was cautious, almost hesitant. "I didn't want to bother you, sir, but I wanted to say something. About earlier." Andrew frowned. "What do you mean?" Paul paused, then continued. "I've driven your family for years, sir. I'd never overstep. But I noticed something odd during the hospital visits before Lily was born. Your mother and Mrs. Eleanor were always secretive about those trips. And the hospital wasn't exactly the one you'd expect for a family like yours." Andrew's chest tightened. "Secretive how?" "They insisted I use a side entrance every time," Paul admitted. "And the hospital itself was under renovation. Not the maternity suite you'd imagine for someone of your means." Andrew gripped the phone tightly. "Why didn't you mention this sooner?" "I didn't think much of it at the time," Paul said, his voice tinged with regret. "But seeing the tension today, I thought you should know." Andrew's mind raced. Eleanor had been glowing in every update during his time away, and Margaret had assured him repeatedly that everything was fine. But Paul's words planted a seed of doubt that began to sprout uncontrollably. "I'll handle it, Paul," Andrew said, his voice steadier than he felt. He ended the call and stood in the dimly lit hallway, his thoughts spiraling. Something about the timeline of Eleanor's pregnancy didn't sit right with him. They had been trying for years. Every attempt had ended in failure, with doctors telling them that their chances were slim to none. Yet only months after his departure, Eleanor had announced her pregnancy. It had seemed like a miracle then. Now, Andrew wasn't so sure. Determined to put his mind at ease, he walked downstairs. The voices in the living room grew louder as he approached. Eleanor and Margaret were sitting on the couch, their postures relaxed, but their eyes wary when they saw him enter. "Everything okay?" Eleanor asked, her tone casual. Andrew forced a smile. Just wanted to check in. I couldn't sleep. Margaret patted the seat beside her. Come sit with us. We were just talking about how beautiful Lily's crib looks in the nursery. Eleanor did such a wonderful job. He nodded, sitting down as requested, but his eyes remained on his wife. Paul called me earlier, he said, testing the waters. He mentioned something about the hospital visits. Eleanor stiffened ever so slightly. Margaret's smile faltered. Oh, Eleanor said, forcing a light tone. What about them? He said you used a side entrance. That doesn't sound like standard practice. Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Margaret, who spoke up first. The hospital was undergoing renovations. It was easier that way. Less chaos, you know. Andrew studied her face. His mother's expression was calm, practiced, but there was something calculated about her response. He turned back to Eleanor. And the side entrance. Was that for convenience too? Eleanor hesitated a fraction too long. Yes, it was closer to the maternity ward. I thought it would be easier for us to get in and out without too much fuss. Andrew nodded slowly, the tension in the room palpable. He decided to let the subject drop for now. Pushing too hard would only make them defensive. Right, he said, leaning back into the couch. I'm probably overthinking it. Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. You've had a long trip, darling. Don't let these little details bother you. Focus on your family. The words were meant to comfort him, but they only deepened his unease. The next morning, Andrew woke to the sound of Lily crying. He hurried to the nursery, finding Eleanor already there, rocking her gently. She's just hungry, Eleanor said, smiling up at him. I'll feed her, and she'll settle down soon. Andrew frowned. I thought you said your milk hadn't come in yet. Eleanor's expression shifted, just for a moment. I meant formula, she said quickly. The doctor recommended we supplement until my milk supply improves. Andrew nodded, but the unease was back. As Eleanor prepared the bottle, he noticed her hands trembling slightly. You seem on edge, he said gently. Is everything okay? Eleanor froze for a split second before laughing nervously. I'm just tired, Andrew. New mom jitters, I guess. Her explanation didn't convince him. Later that day, Andrew decided to visit the hospital alone. Something about Paul's account still nagged at him, and he needed answers. He drove himself, parking outside the hospital and entering through the main doors. At the front desk, he asked about Eleanor's stay. Can you confirm which room my wife was in? He asked, keeping his tone polite. The receptionist looked up the records and frowned. Your wife, Eleanor Miles, was admitted, but the room listed here doesn't seem to match our usual maternity ward. Let me check with someone from the department. Andrew's pulse quickened. Minutes later, a nurse arrived, her expression guarded. Mr. Miles, may I help you? I'm trying to verify my wife's stay here, Andrew said. Something seems off. The nurse hesitated, then lowered her voice. I wasn't working that night, but I've heard rumors. Your wife and another woman. There was an unusual arrangement. You should speak to Dr. Green. He was the attending physician. Andrew felt his stomach drop. Where can I find him? The nurse directed him to the doctor's office. Andrew knocked firmly on the door, his heart pounding. Come in, came a voice from inside. Dr. Green was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a tired expression. When Andrew explained who he was, the doctor leaned back in his chair, his demeanor shifting. Mr. Miles, he said carefully, I'm not sure how much I can disclose. Andrew's frustration boiled over. I just want the truth. Was my wife's pregnancy real? Dr. Green sighed. I didn't handle the delivery myself. But your wife wasn't a typical maternity patient. Her case was unique. Andrew's head spun. Unique how? The doctor hesitated, then finally said, she came in with another woman, Clara Mitchell. Clara gave birth that night. Your wife and Clara were connected through some arrangement. But I wasn't privy to the details. Andrew felt the floor shift beneath him. Are you saying the baby might not be ours? Dr. Green met his gaze, his expression filled with regret. I can't say for certain, but if you have doubts, I suggest you pursue them. Andrew left the hospital in a daze. The world seemed to blur around him as he drove home, his mind replaying the doctor's words over and over. When he pulled into the driveway, Eleanor was waiting on the porch, Lily in her arms. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Andrew stepped out of the car, his legs feeling like lead. He approached his wife slowly, his heart breaking with every step. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. Eleanor's smile faltered. "About what?" Andrew's eyes locked onto hers. "About Lily and the truth." Unraveling the lies. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the driveway as Andrew stood face to face with Eleanor. The tension between them was palpable, thickening the air and rendering the late afternoon unusually quiet. Lily stirred softly in Eleanor's arms, her small movements the only thing breaking the oppressive stillness. "Andrew," Eleanor said cautiously, her voice trembling, "you're scaring me. What's this about?" Andrew's jaw tightened as he wrestled with the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to believe in the life they had built, in the love he thought they shared, but the words of the hospital staff replayed in his mind like a haunting echo. "I went to the hospital," he said finally, his voice steady but icy. "I talked to the staff. They said your delivery wasn't normal." Eleanor's face paled. She took a step back, clutching Lily tighter. "Why would you go there? You've been gone for 6 months, Andrew. I handled everything alone. Why can't you just trust me?" "Trust you?" Andrew's voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. "You expect me to trust you when nothing about this feels right. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Who is Clara Mitchell, Eleanor?" At the mention of the name, Eleanor's expression crumbled. Her lips quivered as she struggled to find the right words. Margaret, who had been watching from the porch, hurried down the steps, inserting herself between them. "Andrew, stop this nonsense," Margaret snapped, her tone sharp and defensive. "Eleanor just gave birth. She doesn't need this stress. We're a family now, and you're ruining it." Andrew turned to his mother, his eyes narrowing. "I'm ruining it. Tell me, Mom, how involved were you in this? You were with Eleanor every step of the way while I was gone. Did you know? Did you help her hide the truth?" Margaret flinched but recovered quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I did what any mother would do. I supported my family. You should be grateful, Andrew." "Grateful?" Andrew's voice cracked with disbelief. "Grateful for what? For being lied to? For being made a fool?" Lily began to cry, the escalating tension upsetting the fragile baby. Eleanor shushed her frantically, her tears spilling over. "Please, Andrew, don't do this. Not here. Not now." Andrew took a step back, his shoulders heaving as he tried to rein in his emotions. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Not here, but this isn't over, Eleanor. Not by a long shot." A desperate confession. That evening, the house was unnervingly quiet. Andrew paced in the living room, his mind racing. Eleanor had locked herself in the nursery with Lily, and Margaret had retreated to her room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping it would steady his nerves, but the questions continued to gnaw at him. Unable to take the silence any longer, he stormed upstairs and knocked firmly on the nursery door. "Eleanor, we need to talk. Now." For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, and Eleanor stood there, her face streaked with tears, her eyes puffy and red. She looked utterly defeated. "Fine," she said, her voice hollow. "Let's talk." They sat in the dimly lit living room, the silence between them stretching unbearably. Eleanor cradled Lily protectively, avoiding Andrew's gaze. "Start from the beginning," Andrew said, his tone softer now, but still firm. "Who is Clara Mitchell?" Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. She's the biological mother," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew's heart sank. He felt as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. "What?" he asked, though he had heard her clearly. Eleanor's words spilled out in a rush, as if releasing them would lessen the weight on her chest. "Your mother found her. She was homeless, desperate. She agreed to be a surrogate for us in exchange for money. We used a side arrangement. No agencies, no official paperwork. Clara needed help, and we needed a child." Andrew's mind reeled. "You didn't think I deserved to know any of this." Eleanor shook her head miserably. "You were gone, Andrew. I didn't want to tell you over the phone. And by the time you were set to come back, Lily was already here. I thought it wouldn't matter once you held her." Andrew clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "You lied to me. You pretended this was your pregnancy. You made me believe this was a miracle." "It was a miracle." Eleanor shot back, her voice trembling. "You don't know what it's like, Andrew. I saw how much you wanted this. After all the failed treatments, all the heartbreak. I couldn't bear to tell you we'd failed again. I wanted to give you the family you dreamed of." Andrew stared at her, his emotions a whirlwind. Anger, betrayal, sorrow, they all clashed inside him, leaving him exhausted. And Clara? What about her? Did she agree to this? Eleanor hesitated, her silence speaking volumes. Andrew leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Did she know you were going to keep her baby?" "She signed an agreement," Eleanor whispered. She was desperate. She didn't have a choice." Andrew stood abruptly, pacing the room. "A choice? Eleanor, you exploited her. You and Mom. You took advantage of a vulnerable woman. And now what? Do you think she's just going to disappear?" "She's gone," Eleanor said quickly, too quickly. "She left the hospital after the birth. She took the money. She won't come back." Andrew turned to her, his eyes burning with fury. "You think money can erase what you did? You think you can just buy a child and walk away? She didn't want the baby." Eleanor shouted, her voice breaking. "She said so herself. She said she couldn't take care of her. We gave Lily a home, a family. Why can't you see that?" Andrew's voice softened, but his words were razor sharp. "Because it's not our choice to make. You stole her baby, Eleanor. And now we're going to have to face the consequences." A shocking development. The next morning, Andrew left the house early, unable to face Eleanor or Margaret. He drove endlessly for hours, trying to clear his head. Eventually, he found himself parked outside a coffee shop. He stepped inside, hoping a strong cup of coffee would help him think more clearly. As he sipped his drink, his phone buzzed. It was a news alert. He glanced at the screen, his stomach dropping as he read the headline. "Homeless mother seeks missing newborn. Claims baby was taken at hospital." Andrew's breath caught in his throat as he read the article. Clara Mitchell's name was listed, along with a plea for anyone with information about her baby to come forward. There was a photo of Clara, her eyes hollow but determined, holding a picture of her newborn. Andrew froze as he recognized the pink blanket and floral headband Lily had worn the day they brought her home. The article detailed Clara's story, how she had given birth at the hospital, how she had been pressured into leaving without her baby, and how she had regretted her decision ever since. The words hit Andrew like a punch to the gut. Before he could think, Andrew dialed the number listed at the end of the article. It was a direct line to a local news reporter covering the story. "Hello," a voice answered. "This is Andrew Miles," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I need to talk to you about Clara Mitchell's baby. The unraveling truth." Andrew hung up the phone after speaking with the reporter, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The reporter had been cautious but curious, asking questions Andrew wasn't ready to answer in full. All he had said was that he had information about Clara Mitchell's missing child and wanted to meet in person. The reporter, a woman named Emma Hayes, agreed to meet him at her office later that afternoon. Now, as he sat alone in his car, staring blankly at the dashboard, he tried to process the weight of what he was about to do. His entire world, his wife, his mother, his family, was on the brink of collapse. Yet in his heart, he knew there was no other choice. The meeting. Emma Hayes' office was a modest space in a small building near the city center. The walls were lined with shelves filled with binders, awards, and photographs of her with various public figures. She greeted Andrew with a firm handshake, her expression one of cautious professionalism. "Mr. Miles," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for reaching out. I must admit, your call surprised me. Most people don't come forward in cases like these." Andrew sat down, his fingers laced tightly together to keep them from trembling. "I didn't know," he said simply. "Not at first." Emma leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Didn't know what?" Andrew exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his confession pressing down on him. "I didn't know that the baby my wife brought home wasn't ours. I didn't know about Clara Mitchell or the deal she made with my family. I didn't know. Until yesterday." Emma's pen hovered over her notebook, her expression unreadable. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, Andrew recounted the events that had unfolded over the past few days. He told Emma about his mother and Eleanor's secrecy during the pregnancy, the strange hospital visits, the rushed delivery, and Clara's involvement. He explained how he had pieced everything together, his doubts growing with every new discovery. When he finished, Emma sat back in her chair, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. "This is significant," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, there's a serious case here. Clara Mitchell's story has been gaining attention, but with your testimony, we could blow this wide open." Andrew nodded, his resolve hardening. "I want to help, but I also need to protect Lily. She's an innocent child in all of this." Emma's expression softened. "I understand. The authorities will handle this delicately. Clara doesn't want to hurt anyone. She just wants her daughter back." Andrew's heart ached at the thought of losing Lily. He had only known her for a few days, but the bond he felt with her was undeniable. Yet he couldn't ignore the truth. She wasn't his to keep. The confrontation. When Andrew returned home, the tension in the house was suffocating. Eleanor was sitting in the living room, her eyes red and puffy, while Margaret stood in the kitchen, her movements unusually quiet. "We need to talk," Andrew said, his voice firm as he entered the room. Eleanor looked up at him, her expression wary. "About what?" "About what happens next," Andrew said, sitting across from her. "I spoke with a reporter today. Emma Hayes. She's covering Clara Mitchell's case." Eleanor's face drained of color. You did what?" "I told her the truth," Andrew said, his voice steady. "About Clara, about Lily, about everything." Eleanor shot to her feet, her voice rising. "How could you do this? She's our daughter, Andrew. Clara gave her up. She doesn't want her back." Andrew stood as well, his temper flaring. "Did she give her up, Eleanor? Or did you and my mother pressure her into it? Did you manipulate a vulnerable woman into handing over her child because you thought you could?" Margaret entered the room, her face set in a mask of defiance. "Don't you dare accuse us of that, Andrew," she said sharply. "We did what we had to do for this family. For you. After everything you and Eleanor went through, this was the only way to give you the life you deserved." "The life I deserved," Andrew said incredulously. "You think this is what I wanted? Lies? Deception? Stealing a child from her mother? What kind of life is that?" Eleanor began to cry, her tears spilling over as she sank back onto the couch. "I didn't know what else to do," she sobbed. "We tried everything, Andrew. Everything. And it all failed. I couldn't bear to disappoint you again." Andrew's heart broke at her words, but his resolve remained firm. "This isn't about me, Eleanor. It's about Lily. And Clara. And doing what's right." Margaret crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You think you're so righteous, Andrew. But you don't understand the sacrifices we've made for you." Andrew turned to his mother, his voice cold. "And you don't understand the damage you've done. This isn't love, Mom. It's control. And it ends now. The call to action. That evening, Andrew made the hardest phone call of his life. He contacted Clara Mitchell directly, with Emma Hayes acting as a mediator. Clara's voice on the other end of the line was hesitant but filled with hope. "Mr. Miles," she said softly. "Yes," Andrew replied, his voice trembling. I'm sorry. For everything. For what my family did to you." There was a pause, and then Clara said, "Is she okay? Is Lily okay?" Andrew closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "She's healthy. She's safe. And she's beautiful." Clara began to cry, her sobs quiet, but heart-wrenching. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me." Emma spoke next, her voice calm and professional. "Clara, we'll work with the authorities to handle this transition carefully. Andrew has agreed to cooperate fully to ensure Lily is returned to you." Andrew's heart shattered at the words, but he knew they were necessary. This was the only way to make things right. A family torn apart. The following days were a blur of meetings, interviews, and legal proceedings. Child Protective Services intervened, taking Lily into temporary custody while the case was resolved. Clara was overjoyed to be reunited with her daughter, though the transition was bittersweet for everyone involved. Eleanor and Margaret faced serious consequences for their actions. Eleanor pleaded with Andrew to forgive her, but their marriage was irreparably damaged. Margaret, defiant to the end, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, further alienating herself from her son. Andrew, now alone in the large, empty house, struggled to come to terms with everything that had happened. He had lost the life he thought he wanted, but he had gained something more valuable: clarity, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing. As he stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Andrew allowed himself a small moment of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The fallout, the once warm and inviting Miles family home, now felt like a hollow shell, a quiet and somber reflection of the life Andrew had once envisioned for himself. Lily's absence was a gaping wound that refused to heal. The nursery, once the epicenter of his dreams for fatherhood, now stood untouched. Toys remained scattered on the floor, and the mobile over the crib swayed faintly in the draft from the open window. Andrew stood in the doorway, staring at the small blanket draped over the edge of the crib, the same pink blanket he'd seen in the news article. His chest tightened with the weight of guilt and loss. For just a moment, he'd allowed himself to believe Lily was his. But the truth was undeniable. She wasn't. She never had been. Eleanor had moved out of the house, her departure filled with bitterness and recriminations. Her last words echoed in his mind. "You'll regret this, Andrew. You've destroyed our family." He wanted to respond, to tell her that this was no family if it was built on lies. But the words never came. Margaret had retreated to her own home, refusing to take responsibility for her role in the deception. "You're overreacting, Andrew," she had said. "We did what we had to do. You'll see that one day." But Andrew doubted he ever would. A broken legacy. At the office, the situation wasn't any better. News of the scandal had spread quickly, damaging the pristine reputation of Miles Logistics. Employees whispered behind Andrew's back, their glances filled with pity or judgment. Even his business partner, Daniel Shaw, had grown distant, the strain of the negative publicity creating a rift between them. One afternoon, Daniel called Andrew into his office. The tension in the room was palpable. "Andrew," Daniel began, his tone measured, "we need to talk about the company's future." Andrew sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I know. The publicity hasn't been good, but we can recover. We just need time." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's not just the publicity. It's you. Your focus has been elsewhere, understandably. But the board is concerned. They're questioning your leadership." Andrew felt a pang of anger and hurt. after everything I've done for this company. This isn't personal, Andrew, Daniel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. We're all under scrutiny now. The board is discussing bringing in new leadership to stabilize things. It might be best if you take a step back, for the company's sake. Andrew leaned back in his chair, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. Take a step back. This company was his legacy, the product of years of hard work and sacrifice. And now it was slipping through his fingers, just like everything else. I'll think about it, Andrew said stiffly, rising to leave. A glimmer of connection. Despite everything, Andrew couldn't stay away from Lily. He knew he had no legal claim to her, but the bond he had formed in those first few days of her life was unbreakable. Clara had been understanding, even kind, in the aftermath of the scandal. She had agreed to let Andrew visit Lily, supervised by a caseworker, while the legal proceedings continued. The visits were bittersweet. Andrew would sit in Clara's modest apartment, holding Lily while Clara watched from a distance. The child had grown in the weeks since she'd been taken from his home, her tiny face lighting up with curiosity as she gazed at the man who had once been her father. One day, as he rocked Lily in his arms, Clara spoke up. "She likes you," she said softly, her voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Andrew looked up, meeting her eyes. "She's an incredible little girl. You're lucky to have her." Clara hesitated, then sat down across from him. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. I can't imagine how hard this has been for you." Andrew shook his head. "It's nothing compared to what you've been through. I can't undo what my family did, but I want to help in any way I can." Clara studied him for a moment, then said, "You already have. By telling the truth, you gave me back my daughter. That means everything to me." Her words brought a flicker of peace to Andrew's troubled heart. An unexpected ally. One evening, as Andrew sat alone in his dimly lit living room, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emma Hayes, the reporter he had worked with to expose the truth. "Andrew, I came across something you might want to see. Can we meet?" Curiosity piqued. Andrew agreed to meet Emma at a quiet cafe downtown. She was waiting for him when he arrived, a folder in front of her. "Thanks for coming," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What's this about?" Andrew asked, eyeing the folder. Emma slid across the table. "I've been digging into Clara's case. And your family. There's something you should know." Andrew opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His stomach twisted as he read. Bank statements, signed agreements, and correspondence between Margaret and a private investigator. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Proof," Emma said. "Your mother didn't just find Clara by chance. She hired someone to track down a vulnerable surrogate. Clara wasn't the first woman she approached. She was just the first to agree." Andrew felt sick. "You're saying my mother planned this from the beginning? That she manipulated Clara into giving up her child?" Emma nodded. "It's worse than that. Clara's pregnancy wasn't accidental. Your mother arranged for a fertility treatment under Clara's name without her full understanding. She essentially created the situation to get what she wanted." Andrew's hands trembled as he closed the folder. The depth of Margaret's betrayal was staggering. "What do I do with this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's up to you," Emma said. "But if you want justice, for Clara, for Lily, you need to act. A decision for the future." Andrew spent the night poring over the documents Emma had given him. The evidence was damning, and it painted a picture of a woman who had gone to unimaginable lengths to control her family's future. By morning, Andrew made his decision. He contacted Clara, explaining what he had learned and asking if she wanted to pursue further legal action. Clara, though shocked and hurt, agreed. Together, they presented the evidence to the authorities, initiating a new investigation into Margaret's actions. The fallout was swift. Margaret faced criminal charges for fraud and coercion, her carefully crafted reputation in ruins. Eleanor, though not directly implicated in the worst of the scheme, found herself ostracized by the community. For Andrew, the road ahead was uncertain. He had lost nearly everything: his marriage, his career, and the family he thought he knew. Yet, as he stood in Clara's apartment one afternoon, holding Lily and watching her giggle at the sound of his voice, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, watching the two of them. Andrew smiled faintly, his heart heavy but resolute. "For what?" "For doing the right thing," Clara replied. As Andrew looked at Lily, her tiny hand wrapping around his finger, he realized that sometimes the right thing came at a great cost. But in the end, it was the only thing that truly mattered: building new bridges. Andrew leaned against the doorframe of Clara's modest apartment, his gaze fixed on Lily as she played on a soft blanket spread across the living room floor. Her laughter was a melody that seemed to chase away the shadows lingering in his heart. Clara sat nearby, sorting through baby clothes she'd received from local charities. The air between them was no longer strained, but instead filled with the quiet understanding of two people trying to piece together lives that had been shattered. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal reckoning. Margaret's actions had been exposed, and her trial loomed on the horizon. Eleanor had disappeared from public view, refusing to speak with Andrew after their marriage had disintegrated under the weight of betrayal. And Andrew? He was left navigating the wreckage, trying to rebuild a life that made sense. For the first time in days, Clara broke the silence. "She loves the sound of your voice, you know," she said softly, nodding toward Lily. Andrew smiled faintly. "I'm not sure why. I'm terrible at singing, and my storytelling skills are pretty rusty." Clara laughed, a sound that was lighter than he'd ever heard from her before. "It's not about what you say. It's about how you say it. Babies can feel when they're safe, when they're loved." Andrew's smile faltered. "I've tried to do right by her, by you, but I can't help feeling like I failed." Clara set down the pile of clothes and turned to face him. "Andrew, you didn't fail. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have Lily back. You stood up when it mattered. That's more than most people would have done." He looked away, the weight of her words pressing on him. "I still can't forgive myself for not seeing the truth sooner." Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You believed in the people you loved. That's not a crime. And now you're here, trying to make things right. That's what matters." A visit to the past. Later that evening, after Lily had been tucked into her crib and the apartment had settled into a peaceful quiet, Andrew sat on the couch, lost in thought. Clara handed him a cup of tea and joined him, her expression contemplative. "Can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. "Of course. What are you going to do now? With your family, I mean." Andrew let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know. Margaret's facing trial, and I've cut ties with Eleanor. There's nothing left of the family I thought I had." Clara studied him for a moment before speaking. "Maybe it's time to redefine what family means to you." Her words lingered in his mind as he drove home that night. The house felt emptier than ever, its grandeur now a hollow reminder of the life he had built and lost. He wandered into the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair and staring at the unused crib. Clara's words echoed in his mind. "Redefine what family means to you." The next day, Andrew made a decision. He drove to Margaret's home, steeling himself for the confrontation he had avoided for weeks. When she opened the door, her expression was a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Andrew," she said curtly, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't expect to see you." He stepped into the familiar living room, its elegance a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around them. "We need to talk." Margaret folded her arms, her posture defensive. "If this is about the trial, I don't want to hear it. I've already said everything I needed to." Andrew shook his head. "It's not about the trial. It's about us. About what you did and why." Margaret's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "I did it for you, Andrew. For our family." "No," Andrew said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "You did it for control, for the idea of what you thought our family should be. But that's not love, Mom. That's manipulation." Her eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them away. "I wanted you to be happy, to have what you deserved. I wanted a family," Andrew said quietly, "but not like this, not at the expense of someone else's happiness." Margaret sank into the armchair, her composure cracking. For the first time, she seemed to truly understand the depth of the damage she had caused. "I never meant for it to turn out like this." Andrew nodded. "I believe you. But intentions don't erase the harm that's been done." They sat in silence for a long moment before Margaret spoke again. "What happens now?" Andrew hesitated, then said, "I don't know. But if you want to be part of my life, part of Lily's life, you need to take responsibility. Admit what you've done. Face the consequences." Margaret's tears fell freely now, but she nodded. "I'll try." A new beginning. In the months that followed, Andrew worked tirelessly to rebuild his life. He stepped down as CEO of Miles Logistics, handing over the reins to his business partner, Daniel. The decision was bittersweet, but it allowed him to focus on what truly mattered. Clara and Lily became an integral part of his world. Their visits grew more frequent, and Clara began to trust Andrew in ways she hadn't before. One day, as they sat in the park watching Lily toddle unsteadily across the grass, Clara turned to him with a tentative smile. "You've been more of a father to her than I ever expected," she said. "Thank you for that." Andrew shook his head. "You're her mother, Clara. She's lucky to have you." "And she's lucky to have you too," Clara said softly. "If you want, we could make this more official." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we can find a way for you to be part of her life permanently, not just as a visitor." Tears welled in Andrew's eyes as he nodded. "I'd like that. More than anything. Healing through love." In time, Andrew became a consistent presence in Lily's life. Though he and Clara weren't romantically involved, they forged a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared love for the little girl who had brought them together. Margaret, after a long and grueling trial, accepted a plea deal. Though her relationship with Andrew remained strained, she began to take small steps toward redemption, volunteering her time to help vulnerable families and using her resources to support Clara and Lily's future. Eleanor, however, chose a different path. She disappeared from their lives entirely, unable to face the reality of her actions. Andrew mourned the loss of the woman he had once loved, but found peace in letting go. As the years passed, the pain of betrayal and loss faded, replaced by the joy of watching Lily grow. Andrew attended her first birthday party, helped her take her first steps, and celebrated every milestone as if it were his own. One evening, as Andrew tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy?" she said softly, her voice filled with innocent wonder. Andrew's heart swelled. "Yes, sweetheart." "Will you always be here?" she asked. He kissed her forehead, his voice steady and sure. "Always, Lily. Always." For the first time in a long while, Andrew felt whole. Though his path had been filled with heartbreak and hardship, it had led him to a place of love and healing, and for that he was grateful. Closure and new horizons. As Andrew closed Lily's bedroom door, the warmth of her words lingered in his heart. He leaned against the doorframe, letting the moment wash over him. The journey that had brought him here, filled with betrayal, loss, and self-discovery, was one he never would have chosen. Yet, standing in the quiet hallway of Clara's modest home, he felt an undeniable sense of purpose. He had found a family, not the one he expected, but one that was real and built on love. Downstairs, Clara was in the kitchen, tidying up from dinner. The clatter of dishes and the hum of the evening news created a comforting backdrop. Andrew joined her, rolling up his sleeves and reaching for a dish towel. "You don't have to do that," Clara said, smiling softly. "I want to," Andrew replied. "It feels good to be useful." They worked in silence for a moment before Clara spoke again. "You've been amazing with Lily. She adores you." "She's easy to adore," Andrew said, his voice filled with emotion. "She's the best part of all of this." Clara nodded, her eyes growing misty. "I don't know how I would have done this without you. After everything, I didn't think I could trust anyone again. But you've shown me that not everyone is out to take advantage." Andrew set down the dish he was drying and turned to her. "You've been through so much, Clara, more than anyone should ever have to. But you're stronger than you know. And Lily is lucky to have you as her mom." Clara smiled, a flicker of hope shining in her eyes. "And she's lucky to have you as her, well, whatever this is." Andrew chuckled. "We'll figure it out, together." Rebuilding relationships. As the months turned into years, life settled into a new rhythm. Andrew and Clara co-parented Lily with ease, their partnership built on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. They celebrated birthdays, milestones, and everyday moments as a team. Though their relationship remained platonic, the bond they shared grew stronger with each passing day. Margaret's redemption arc was slow but steady. Her volunteer work with families in need earned her respect in the community, though it didn't erase the pain she had caused. Andrew visited her occasionally, their conversations tentative but sincere. Over time, they began to rebuild their relationship, though it would never be the same. Eleanor remained a ghost from the past. Occasionally, Andrew would hear rumors of her whereabouts, but she never reached out. He mourned the loss of the woman he once loved, but he knew that some relationships were best left behind. A new chapter. One crisp autumn afternoon, Andrew found himself sitting on a park bench, watching Lily play with other children on the playground. Her laughter rang out, bright and carefree, as she slid down the slide and ran back to the jungle gym. Clara sat beside him, sipping a cup of coffee and smiling at the scene. "She's growing up so fast," Clara said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "It feels like just yesterday she was learning to crawl." Andrew nodded. "She's amazing. Every time I see her, I'm reminded of what matters." Clara glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed, you know." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You're more grounded," she said. "More present. When we first met, you seemed so consumed by your work, by what people expected of you. But now, it's like you found what really makes you happy." Andrew considered her words, a small smile playing on his lips. "I think I have. And it's not the company or the big house or the accolades. It's this. It's Lily. It's knowing that I'm part of something real." Clara reached over and squeezed his hand. "You deserve that." The final moment. Years later, as Lily stood on the stage at her school's graduation ceremony, Andrew and Clara sat side by side in the audience, beaming with pride. Lily had grown into a confident, compassionate young woman, her spirit unbroken by the turmoil of her early years. When her name was called, she walked across the stage with a radiant smile, accepting her diploma with grace. She glanced out into the crowd, her eyes finding Andrew and Clara. Her smile widened, and she gave a small wave, her gratitude and love evident in the simple gesture. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Lily ran toward them, her diploma clutched tightly in her hand. Andrew opened his arms, and she leaped into them, laughing as he spun her around. "I did it, Daddy," she exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. "Yes, you did," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Clara joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them in a warm embrace. In that moment, surrounded by the love of the family they had built together, Andrew felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Life had taken him down a path he never expected, but it had brought him to a place of healing and hope. As he looked at Lily, the daughter who had changed everything, he knew one thing for certain. No matter the challenges, no matter the pain, it had all been worth it. For love, for family, and for the future they had created together.